Thank you, Tom, and welcome to all. Welcome to MALDEF's live webcast of Latino State of the Union 2014. I am Elizabeth Espinosa, host of CNN Latino's Sin Límites, which means no limits, a daily live Spanish language national talk show based in Los Angeles, my hometown. I'm also happy to share with you that I'm the only woman, first Latina, to join the weekday lineup on KFI 640 AM Talk Radio, and that is the country's #1 talk radio station. I'm also a newscaster with KTLA 5 in Los Angeles. I obviously have no free time. Anyway, I'm proud to serve today as a moderator for today's event because on behalf of MALDEF, I'd like to thank each of you from around the country for joining us on this live stream. And of course, from the audience right here, live at the Time Warner Center, New York City. Thank you. It's cold, but nothing stops New Yorkers, and that's what we love about you. MALDEF is the Latino legal voice for civil rights in America, promoting social change through advocacy, communications, community, education, litigation, the areas of education, employment, immigrant rights, and more importantly, political access. The Latino community faces significant challenges in working to shape a national policy agenda that incorporates our growing concerns. And anyone who's observed our nation in the last several years knows that the need for MALDEF's work is more important than ever. So today, we promise a very lively discussion of critical public policy issues facing us, facing Latinos. We will hear remarks from MALDEF's president, you saw on tape, and General Counsel in the United States, Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, our panelists of national Latino leaders, including Jose Calderon, President of the Hispanic Federation, Maria Gabriela Gaby Pacheco, Co-Director of the Bridge Project, Arturo Vargas, Executive Director of NALEO, and Tanya Hernandez, Professor of Law at Fordham University School of Law. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce the Executive Director, Workforce Diversity and Inclusion for Time Warner. Please welcome Jonathan Bean.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good evening to those in attendance, and welcome to those watching live by webcast. As Elizabeth said, my name's Jonathan Bean. I'm responsible for workforce diversity and inclusion at Time Warner Corporate. Our Chief Diversity Officer and Head of Corporate Responsibility, Lisa Garcia Quiroz, unfortunately was not able to make it tonight, but she does send her regards to MALDEF, U.S. Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, the esteemed panelist, Tom, and of course, the MALDEF team. We're once again very proud to be hosting MALDEF's Latino State of the Union event at the Time Warner Center. As we know, the state of Latinos has made a great deal of progress over the last 50 years, but much of that progress is due to the extremely important advocacy work that MALDEF has done in vital areas like workers' rights, education, immigration, and voting rights. The progress and impact of MALDEF's work since 1968 has been nothing short of astounding. However, as we all know, there's still much more work to be done. And Tom Saenz is the leader to make it happen. For those of you who have not had the opportunity to meet or know Tom, his passion, vision, and directness is contagious. He cares deeply about the condition of the Latino community and the critical role it plays in American society. Having a continual dialogue on the Latino State of the Union and the vital public policy issues of today is so important. And we at Time Warner are honored to provide the stage to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, now I want you to help me welcome United States Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas.
I'm honored to join you this evening. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I am especially honored to work alongside you as we work to help realize the possibilities of what it means to be a nation of immigrants, a nation that welcomes and embraces those who seek to share our ideals and who dream of making America their home. We are on the threshold of seeing distant dreams become a reality. For the immigrant youth who were brought here as children, for parents, spouses, and children waiting in the green card backlog to be united with their loved ones, for students who came here to study in our finest institutions and who want to create the next new industry and American jobs, and for the undocumented who have put down roots here and who are contributing to our nation's well-being today and who are part of its prosperous tomorrow. We are still in the midst of the immigration reform debate, and we cannot give up. The President, Secretary Johnson, and I remain firmly committed to ensuring that we enact legislation this year that will help these dreams become a reality and that is consistent with the administration's principles for reform. That includes creating an earned path to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented immigrants living among us and who are contributing to our communities, our economy, and our future. While no one expects citizenship to be automatic, the path must be meaningful and citizenship attainable. In the last year of my tenure as Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, I had the opportunity to work with many of you as we developed and implemented the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals process, or DACA as we commonly know it. I worked closely with many of you to ensure that the program was shaped and executed in a way that met the needs and aspirations of our youth and our community, just as I worked with other partners, such as our law enforcement colleagues, to build the program with integrity and security. I learned a great deal from you, and I continue to do so as we prepare to begin the process for DACA recipients to renew their deferred action and work authorization. I'm incredibly impressed with your advocacy and your passion, and I am grateful for your partnership and insight. I intend to build on our partnership in my new capacity as a Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security. It is, after all, partnership and collaboration that enable people in different positions to achieve common goals and a united vision. Allow me to comment upon a few of the challenges that we face together as partners on the threshold of comprehensive immigration reform. Challenges that are not only mine as a government official, but that are yours as well as partners. I specifically focus on those challenges that derive from the lessons of DACA and from my experience at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. First is the critical issue of access. As we envision and build programs for the currently or formerly disenfranchised, how can we be sure that those who are eligible can meaningfully access the relief provided? While approximately 600,000 youth requested DACA, we understand that for some, the cost of the request keeps the much-needed relief out of reach. It is something we in the government are assessing and exploring intensely right now to determine what, if anything, we can do to build greater access to the program, especially at this time as we begin the DACA renewal process, while at the same time building and abiding by our mandate to implement the program in a way that covers its cost. The issue of cost and the consequent issue of access increases in magnitude as we consider the path to legal status for the millions of undocumented who will benefit from comprehensive immigration reform and who will have fees, fines, and penalties to pay. Just as we in government must plan to develop a program that executes legislative intent and provides access, so too must you, as partners, consider the issue of access and how you can help build it. To this day, there remains an unfulfilled opportunity to build a net of financial support for those who seek access to avenues of immigration relief that now exist. Though funding mechanisms for DACA-eligible youth were slow in the making and thinly resourced, New York was a leader in meeting this need through the creation of the New York City Dreamer Loan Fund. As we look to the future, we must ask ourselves some key questions. What funding streams will be created to support the youth in need who will age into the DACA program, or who will seek to renew their DACA, or for the many millions more who might be eligible for the legislative reform for which we now advocate? What other streams of support and therefore access can we develop? In many places around the world, the phenomenon of microlending has gained prominence and achieved success. Does that means of assistance have promise here in the context of immigration relief or reform? This is a vital question of access as we consider the reality that many who dwell in the shadows are struggling in the widening gap between the rich and the poor. Our community must focus on and prepare for the need and the opportunity of financial support and the access it can provide. Access is an issue of cost, but certainly not cost alone. Independent of cost, there is the need for the provision of pro bono legal services. One of the dramatic lessons of DACA was the unfulfilled need for youth to access qualified legal advice in tackling the DACA form and eligibility requirements. We in the government are obliged to promulgate clear and accessible forms and processes and issue guidance that assists those who seek to avail themselves of the programs we administer. There also remains a need for pro bono counsel, and this need will expand given the breadth of hope for legislative reform. Certainly, there were extraordinary legal assistance processes provided in the DACA program, whether through MALDEF, CHIRLA in Los Angeles, the New York Immigration Coalition, or through the many other dedicated organizations throughout the country. But there was, and there remains, an unfulfilled need. Individuals' access to the reform that Congress can and will ultimately provide will depend on filling that need. Together, we must build access to the relief our system now provides and the relief it will provide in the not-too-distant future. Whether by reducing financial burdens or providing assistance to meet financial thresholds, whether by being there to help navigate legal questions and issues that can be daunting for immigrant families, whatever the nature of the support that is needed, together as partners, we must build access to the dreams that reform will help realize. In building that access, we in the government must affirmatively extend the reach that defines the meaning of public service. In U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, we've created mobile services, traveling to reach farm workers toiling in the fields and the immigrants resident in rural or remote locations. We began to host our public engagements in different languages, in Spanish, Enlace, Chinese, Vietnamese, and others to help ensure that barriers were overcome so that communities, however diverse, had access to our services. It is access and equal access that is at the core. Importantly, there is one critical threshold that we must meet that will enable the paths of access to be built. That is the foundation of openness and transparency that is a hallmark of good government. This threshold, this foundation of true partnership, is our responsibility in the government. I am proud of the Office of Public Engagement that we built in U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and of the open processes we developed and implemented for the formulation of policy and for the exchange of ideas and perspectives on issues of importance to the communities we serve. This must be the model for the Department of Homeland Security as a whole, and it is the model that we will build. In the coming weeks and months, I look forward to working with you and sitting with you, together with my colleagues from USCIS, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection, all of whom I am proud to work alongside, and to sharing information with you and discussing your concerns and challenges. They are concerns and challenges we must address, and we must do so together. We will begin a dialogue and a process that is open, that is not unilateral, but that instead involves the exchange of information and views, that is robust, and that will be ongoing and become institutionalized. Only through openness and candor, through greater collaboration, can we begin to build a level of trust. Distrust is a barrier to the very access of which I speak. It can prevent an eligible but fearful immigrant from seeking the relief our nation extends, and it precludes the very partnership to which we all aspire and that we must have to ensure the success of our common goals and our shared vision. I am taking that for action. Our ambitions, said Cesar Chavez, must be broad enough to include the aspirations and needs of others for their sakes and for our own. Thank you for allowing me to share some thoughts with you this evening, for providing me with the opportunity to further gain your trust and to partner with you. Thank you.
Gracias. Gracias. Thank you, Deputy Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, who used to live on the west side, I asked. Y es cubano, sí? So we have Latino representation. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Thomas Saenz, President and General Counsel of MALDEF. Tom is one of our country's most respected and experienced civil rights lawyers and leaders. He is a summa cum laude graduate of Yale with degrees in history, political economy. He received his law degree, his JD, from Yale Law School, where he received awards for moot court, for clinical work. In the 1990s, Tom Saenz led MALDEF in a successful challenge, you may remember, of California's Proposition 187. Remember that? Which would have denied countless immigrants critical public services. Saenz was also lead counsel in several important challenges to anti-day labor ordinances, in two challenges to California's Proposition 227, which mandated English-only instruction in classrooms, in a challenge to California's 2001 congressional redistricting plan, and in many other civil rights lawsuits. He also initiated the lawsuit that led to a $50 million employment discrimination settlement against Abercrombie and Fitch. Tom served as counsel to Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa for 4 years, where as a member of the mayor's 4-person executive team, he advised the mayor on critical issues like education reform, labor relations, litigation risk avoidance, and living wage laws. So please help me here. Lots of energy. Let's welcome Thomas Saenz, the President and General Counsel of MALDEF.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks to all of you who are joining us today, both here and virtually. And a special thanks to Deputy Secretary Mayorkas, both for your thoughtful and informative remarks today, but more importantly, for the wisdom and insight that you daily bring to the job, where you are working in partnership with Secretary Johnson to create a more humane immigration regulatory regime. Thank you also for reasserting your commitment and the broader administration's commitment to the critical immigration reform policy change. Yet, in the Latino community, no one could be faulted for some amount of disappointment. Here we are more than 15 months after the triumph of the last presidential election, a triumph for the Latino voting community when pundits nationwide virtually universally recognize the critical and decisive role that Latinos played in the outcome. We had reason to believe, because of that triumph, that there would be swifter action on behalf of Congress to enact the immigration reform that our country so desperately needs. But it seems that too many of our political leaders suffer from what could be characterized as selective political amnesia. How quickly they forget the impact of the Latino vote in November 2012, how quickly they forget that this community will hold them accountable for their failure to act in response to our votes and our opinions. It is a selective amnesia because, ironically, in this week when we nationwide celebrate the first president of the United States and the anniversary of his birth, yet political leaders who can remember over 200 plus years ago can't seem to recall what happened in November 2012. But we know one cure to this selective political amnesia. It's a re-inoculation, if you will. Clearly, there needs to be a booster shot administered to America's polity this November at the midterm elections. And we in the Latino community must ensure that that re-inoculation, that reminder, that solution to the amnesia is administered well and effectively in those midterm elections. But I believe there is another related but different malady that afflicts our political nation. For behind all of the opposition to immigration reform, across the entire spectrum, from those who would delay to those who would obstruct to those who would vilify and hate, there lies a fear, often unspoken, in some cases perhaps unconscious, but a fear about what a United States with a growing Latino population, a growing Latino significance would mean to this country's future. This demographic fear that somehow the growth of the Latino community fostered through the enactment of reforms like a program that would recognize and reward the efforts of the many immigrants who have toiled without full legal protections to build their families, to build communities, to build economies across the country. A fear of what a United States with such a growing Latino population would be and how it might differ from a predecessor era in this nation's history. This demographic fear, which might clinically be called a Latinophobia, also requires attention, requires treatment. I think fortunately, with respect to this Latinophobia, our nation is not yet at the point that it requires institutionalization, not yet at the point that it requires some sort of shock therapy, beyond perhaps the renewed shock of the critical and decisive Latino vote in November 2014 that I previously mentioned. But we need to address this phobia with talk therapy. And that's part of what this Latino State of the Union event is about. In a few minutes, we'll engage in a conversation that is a part of that talk therapy with some of our nation's leading Latino and Latina thinkers. But I believe a part of that talk therapy has to be about pointing out the obvious, because the answer to that fear is on the face of the story of November 2012. The significant Latino turnout and its decisive impact was tied by most analysts correctly to the need for changes in our immigration system. And the changes that we seek, we know, are rational and in our nation's own self-interest. A legalization program would boost our economy, would boost the nation's budget, would ensure that there will be no disruption of the communities and economies and families that have been built over decades. Also, from the intellectual perspective, we know that the reform we seek is consistent with our nation's long-standing principles. We need to abandon an immigration system that continues to engage daily in discrimination on the basis of national origin, the pernicious effects of national origin quotas that ensure that potential immigrants from certain countries, including Mexico, wait longer, years and years longer, than similarly situated immigrants from other nations. We need to change such a system to be consistent with our principles. Similarly, We know that we must reform our detention and court system in the immigration context when, if we were to show the nation what occurs daily in detention and in immigration court, none of them would recognize it as consistent with our due process beliefs. And from a philosophical perspective, our views on immigration are very, very American. They are a recommitment to our history of recognizing that immigrant success leads to national success. But beyond immigration, the November 2012 Latino vote also demonstrates something else about our community. It demonstrates a deep belief in the right to vote as a right that belongs to every eligible American and that ought not be obstructed under any circumstances. It is a story that indicates the Latino community will be the most tenacious advocate for ensuring that that right to vote is adequately protected. The Latino community will be the most vociferous in denouncing the false allegation that voter fraud somehow significantly affects our system. The story of November 2012 demonstrates that the Latino community will be second to none in seeking to ensure that our Congress enacts the Voting Rights Act amendments necessary to overturn that pernicious and disconnected decision of the United States Supreme Court majority in Shelby County last spring. The Latino community will also insist that Congress enact amendments that will address not only the long-standing patterns of discrimination that we have seen across the nation, but concentrated in certain regions, but will also include protections for the new and emerging populations across the country that often experience voter suppression, voter deterrence, just as they are reaching the point of significant local and state political power. The story of November 2012, far beyond the presidential election, also reiterates the Latino community's commitment to education. In my own home state of California, Latinos overwhelmingly supported tax increases to ensure that the long-standing pattern of deep cuts in education budgets would end. Consistent with the Latino community's views over time, November 2012 demonstrated a deep commitment in our community to public education. The Latino community will be among the strongest advocates, as they long have been, for recognizing and investing adequately in education, public education, as a community asset. The Latino community will lead the fight to ensure that equity in education ultimately becomes a reality. MALDEF contributes through our ongoing litigation in Texas and elsewhere, but the Latino community, through community organizing and demanding and voting, consistently seeks to ensure that we prioritize addressing the educational gap as a significant measure toward ensuring that our nation thrives in the future. And the Latino community, by example and by advocacy, will be the strongest supporter for parental involvement in education, parental involvement that is universal and extends even to those who lack the right or ability to vote and influence outcomes in school board elections. Those parents, too, must be given the right and ability to determine the educational future of their children and their communities. There, on the face of the story of November 2012, a principled adherence by the Latino community to the immigrant history that is so richly contributing in an ongoing way to the success of our nation. There, on the face of November 2012, a tenacious defense of democratic participation, the right to vote, open to all. There, on the face of November 2012, a commitment and dedication to education and recognition that opportunity for everyone is the greatest recipe for ultimate success of our nation. MALDEF, through our work in our courts nationwide, in the halls of Congress and legislatures, in broadcasts and webcasts and narrowcasts regularly ensures that our work reinforces this message, this talk therapy, that the Latino community is not something to fear. We have a demonstrated and deep commitment to the principles of this nation. Indeed, we will be in the lead in demanding a greater loyalty to the principles that form the background, the backbone of this nation. But we work together with our partners, supporters in the Latino community and other communities to ensure that that talk therapy, that demonstration of our commitment to our Constitution and the principles that are talked so much about, but too often not used in application. And so we look to all of you who participate today to join with us in ensuring that we not only re-inoculate against that selective political amnesia this November, but in an ongoing way we demonstrate that there is no basis, there is no rational reason to fear the growth of the Latino community. And so we turn now to a reinvigorated beginning of that talk therapy with a conversation with our esteemed panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. California guy like me. Though I'm not a guy, but there it is. In the last election, the Latino vote made a difference. There's no secret about that. In deciding our president, this shift in political clout has propelled the Latino community's contributions, I think we'd all agree, to the national stage like never before. And the opportunity for greater understanding and therefore change. Change has never been more prevalent. So while we have not shown political clout, we have yet to have sufficient or proportionate representation in high offices. Latinos are the fastest growing demo in the country. You know this. We are amongst, though, the poorest, hit hardest by the mortgage crisis, while we have a powerful trillion-dollar buying power. I know I'm at the mall all the time, too. We have the least access to collateral to grow our business. How does that work? Demographics make up 1/4 of all college-age kids. We graduate, hear this, less than 12% from college. 36% of our kids live in poverty. For the first time, we have a real shot here at reforming immigration. Yet we are still deporting more of our people than at any other time in U.S. history. While we have halted the deportation of the dreamers, los soñadores, there's no sure pathway yet for them for citizenship. So we live in a time of great hope, but great dichotomy. And today, we have an opportunity to understand the duality more than ever and discuss ways to best navigate towards equity, promise, and pathways to truly capitalize on our great potential. And now, I'd like to introduce to you our very distinguished panel you've been staring at today. Maria Gabriela Gavi Pacheco is the co-director of the Bridge Project, a project aimed at connecting individuals from across the political spectrum to achieve immigration reform that is sensible and workable for all. She, get this, she's undocumented and an immigrant rights leader who in 2010 walked 1,500 miles. Let me say that again, 1,500 miles from Miami to Washington, D.C. to urge President Obama to stop the separation of families and deportations of DREAM Act eligible youth. As political director of United We Dream, she spearheaded efforts that led President Obama to announce the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, one of the biggest changes in the immigration system since the 1986 amnesty. Aplauso. Arturo Vargas, Executive Director of the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, you may refer to as NALEO, a national membership organization of Latino policymakers and their supporters. He is also executive director of the Naleo Educational Fund, an affiliated national nonprofit organization aimed at strengthening American democracy by promoting the full participation of Latinos in civic life, which means we got to vote. Arturo is nationally recognized as an expert in Latino demographic trends, electoral participation, voting rights, the census, and redistricting. Arturo Vargas. Also with us today, Professor Tanya K. Hernandez. Tanya K. Hernandez is a professor of law at Fordham University School of Law here in New York, where she teaches comparative employment, discrimination, critical race theory, the science of implicit bias and the law, new pathways to social justice, and trusts and wills. What does that mean? But we'll ask her later. She received her degree from Brown University and her JD, her law degree, from Yale Law School, where she served as Note Topics editor of the Yale Law Journal. Tanya. And with us, Jose Calderon, president of the Hispanic Federation, the nation's premier Latino nonprofit membership organization. Jose manages the organization's overall operations with a primary focus on strategic planning, program development, public policy advocacy, and resource development. He is a leading advocate for Hispanic grassroots organizations and pro-Latino legislation locally and nationwide. And, sorry. Just wanted to see if you were listening to me, Jose, that's all. Just kidding. That was on me. All right, also joining, of course, our discussion, our lively discussion today, panel discussion here with us is, of course, you just heard from this gentleman, Tom Sides, President and General Counsel of MALDEF. So I did just fly out from Hollywood, so what are you wearing? Kidding, we will start with a different question. We have some very important topics to discuss, so let's start with the issue that remains on everyone's mind, right? A full 15 months after this historic presidential election and the acknowledged pivotal role of the Latino community, immigration reform. So, Jose,
yes.
Together with MALDEF, your organization co-chairs the Immigration Committee, right, of the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda, NHLA. It's a coalition of 37 leading national Latino civil rights organizations. So what are the prospects, in your opinion, in terms of will there be immigration reform in 2014?
So it's a depressing state of affairs. To be honest with you, we don't expect immigration reform to pass this year. Does it mean that we don't continue to advocate and push for immigration reform? The reality is that this has been an ongoing struggle, right? For over the past 10 years, we've been working to push for progressive immigration reform. The reality is that we are confronted with a minority that's entrenched, that is the modern version of the Know-Nothing Party that we had back in the 1800s. We decided back in 2008 that we really needed to do massive voter registration to combat the entrenched anti-immigrant sentiments that existed within the Hill. And we've been very successful at doing that. I mean, you look at the last elections, we had over 10 million Latinos go out to vote. It's a significant increase from a very period of time. We need to double down on those efforts. But the reality is that while we were doing that, there was an entrenched minority that was doing backroom deals and redistricting themselves into power. And so when you hear Tom and when you hear Arturo screaming from the top of the lungs, redistricting, 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 it's not because they're crazy. They're a little off, but not because they're crazy, but it is because that process really matters. And it matters when you look at demographics across this nation. The reality is that we have over 55 million Latinos, and yet we have House Republicans, 70% of House Republicans that have very small Latino constituency, a very small immigrant constituency. And the reality is that, again, they've carved out these ultra-conservative districts for themselves. We need to be paying attention when that happens, in addition to, obviously, the voter registration, in addition to all the community organizing that we need to do. So the reality is right now that, I don't think that immigration reform will happen this year. We need to continue the struggle. But I would say this, right, and let me end here. Immigration reform is inevitable. It is inevitable. We've been losing the battles at the federal level for a long period of time. But this battle, this war, right, we will win this, right? So Martin Luther King is famous for saying that the arc of the moral universe is long, right? But it bends towards justice. I firmly believe that. So we keep the course. We're on the right side of history. We will win that battle. But what we cannot do in the process is give away the store. For the simple fact that our community is desperate, that so many people in our community are suffering, we cannot forsake future generations for the sake of expediency. So we need to keep the course, keep the battles, and ultimately we will be successful. ¿Verdad? Sí se puede.
Sí se puede.
Yep.
You know, and I've heard other people, Juan Jose Gutierrez from Vamos Unidos USA, who thinks there will be. So it's interesting, there's all these different, you know, remaining hopeful, but some folks actually think this may just happen. Let me go to Gabby Pacheco. You've become a very recognized, significant spokesperson, advocate on behalf of Dreamers. What about the prospects for a bipartisan solution with respect to these young folks who virtually everyone believes they merit some form of relief? Because in so many cases, right, kids say, I was 10 months old. I was 5 years old when they crossed the border. I had no idea.
Well, it definitely is the fact that those streamers started talking and saying, I came here when I was 10 months old, and sharing their stories. And we realized the power that we had when we started sharing our stories and started changing the perception and started changing the way people thought about us. And just recently, I was quoted in the New York Times talking about this and saying, we've been able to win the hearts of Americans all across, from sea to shining sea. They see that Dreamers and our families, we represent what the American dream is. We represent what it is to fight, to put on our bootstraps, and work really hard to achieve the goals that we want, which is to be a contributing member of the society and fight in order for us to continue to have a great nation.
Let me just ask you, how old were you when you came here?
So I was 8 years old.
Okay, from?
Yeah, from Ecuador.
Okay.
Yeah. And the bipartisanship, I think it's really important. And one of the things that I wanted to add to what Jose was saying is that even if we don't get an immigration reform that passes Congress, right now we are getting a lot of immigration reform legislation that are passing local communities in the states. We just recently won in-state tuition and what they call the DREAM Act in Washington State. New Jersey, the governor, he's a Republican, signed the in-state tuition law. We
The
have
guy with the
19
bridge?
states.
Sorry, there was something there. I thought of
It
traffic.
was before the bridge.
Yeah, before that, but it shows the power. Just today we had South Carolina introducing a Republican in-state tuition legislation that would allow Dreamers to be able to go to college. And those are wins that we're seeing in our community. Those are important wins. We're going to continue to win driver's licenses in different states for the undocumented population. And so we cannot necessarily say that because comprehensive immigration reform is not happening, we have failed. And on the contrary, because of what we're seeing across the country, I think we're winning, and the bipartisanship is starting to finally come through.
You're saying it's these smaller battles, okay. Tom, you discussed immigration reform quite a bit in your remarks. Of course, this is the million-dollar question everyone poses, right? What should the community be doing now? What should they be doing now to support swifter, being the operative word in this, right? Swifter action on immigration reform that recognizes the contributions, of course, of what it's an estimated more than 1 million undocumented immigrants who go out in peaceful demonstrations, who live without full legal protections and go out to work?
Well, I think we need to make sure that we let them know that they're not going to beat us by attrition, by delay and delay and delay. We have to continue the drumbeat, let them know continually, leadership in Congress and indeed in state houses and in local city councils across the country, that this is a critical issue and we're not going to forget it. We're not going to decide that after a certain amount of time we lose interest in it. I'm a little bit more optimistic than my colleague Jose. I think that there's still a chance in 2014, but that chance really depends on our continuing to ensure that everyone in Congress understands how important this is. Because even those who may be in relatively isolated districts without significant Latino or immigrant populations, and that's not as many as you might think. There are really a lot of immigrants and Latinos in districts that are electing folks who are opposed to immigration reform, and we've got to keep up the pressure on them to recognize the importance of this. Because even in those isolated districts, sometimes Congress members have ambitions that go beyond their own district. We all know this. They might, without even saying it at this point in time, have an ambition of succeeding their United States Senator or becoming governor of the state. And they need to understand that we will have a long memory. And that what happened in November 2012 and what will happen again in November 2014 is something that will continue to occur to those who fail to recognize the importance of the issue and the importance of this community's concerns and the importance of this community's desire to address the 11 million undocumented immigrants who have been here making contributions to our community, to our economy, to our society, and deserve to have full legal protections as they move forward in continuing to do that.
Okay. Tanya, our legal professor, explain again your bio. Kidding, we're not going to go there. Our community has understandably, focused on the need for federal reform, as well as we know the draconian state anti-immigrant laws like Arizona's SB 1070. But sometimes there are less visible effects from anti-immigrant public discourse. What are some of those hidden effects?
I'm glad you asked that, because while the anti-immigrant sentiment and discourse, public discourse in the state, in the United States, is obviously targeted to those who are undocumented, it has ripple effects for all Latinos and Latinas. One place where we see this is in the employment sector, right, in which Latinos who are documented are confronted with the presumption stereotype that they are undocumented, illegal in that derivative and derogatory fashion that they are called, and thus they are constantly placed at the lowest rung. Indeed, Maldef recently filed a lawsuit in Los Angeles against the Westminster Police Department, because what were they doing? Here were documented Latino, Latina police officers. They go to the academy, they do what they're supposed to do to contribute, to be valuable members, part of law enforcement. And what do they confront? Promotion policies that consistently ignore them. Assignment policies that consistently relegate them to the very bottom, so that they can't advance because they're not being given the plum assignments with which to prove that they can do more and better. And so that's just one small example of a workplace in which documented Latinos feel the ripple effects of the anti-immigrant sentiment in the nation.
Or I was just talking to Hilda Solis, and we talked about former Secretary of Labor. And I said, I'm sure at some point in Washington, somebody must have asked you, do you speak English? And she said, yeah, they would actually confuse her with her husband and think that he was a secretary and she was a spouse. And I said, yeah, and listen, I'm in media and I've had people ask me if I speak English. I'm like, actually I do. Who knew? Breaking news. That in 4 more languages, huh? Kind of feels smart. Not like the panel we have here, but Arturo, vamos contigo. Beyond the undocumented, the Latino community has millions, right, of immigrants with legal status who are eligible to naturalize, become a U.S. citizen. That would increase the Latinos' political clout, la fuerza, no? Más, even more. What is the scope of that challenge, and what can be done to address that? Because the Pew Hispanic Research Center, of course, always brings up those numbers that there is a resistance to become a U.S. citizen.
Well, thank you for that. There's not a resistance, there's barriers to become a U.S. citizen. Let's be honest about how difficult this process can be. And let me just recognize Secretary Mayorkas for the work he did when he led the USCIS to try to make that process more accessible, to provide fee waivers to people who can't afford $700, which is a lot of money if you're only making $12,000 a year. Barriers of having to demonstrate proficiency in English when you're already a senior citizen. Barriers of having to make the choice of where you spend your resources. So we need to have a naturalization process that's accessible, but we also need to reach out to those who have the ability today to become U.S. citizens because they've been here at least 5 years with a green card to apply for naturalization. And part of what it takes is for people to understand how important that is. And I'll tell you the story about one woman I know who came to this country in 1952. She came here from Mexico, and it wasn't until 1994 that she decided to apply for U.S. citizenship. And at the time, I worked at Maldef, And she went to a NALEO citizenship workshop and filled out her form. I went to her naturalization ceremony and I asked her, Mom, why did you finally decide to become a citizen? And she looked at me and she said, this was all in Spanish. She said, because I want to vote. And this was 1994. This was the year of Proposition 187. She had had enough of the anti-immigrant, of the anti-Mexican sentiment that was happening in California. She had had enough of being mutated in our political process, and she wanted a voice. She hasn't missed an election since 1994.
Wow, that's amazing. Congratulations to her.
So we need to reach out to all those 5 million Latinos who can become U.S. citizens, but we also need to reach out to 11.2 million Latino U.S. citizen adults born in this country who speak English and only English, and convince them that the political process still can work for us. Because many of them have given up on our political process because of the kinds of things that have happened with redistrictings that keep a community from voting, and from politicians that don't deliver on their promises. We need to make sure that this political system actually works for all our community.
Thank you. Gabby, another important form of relief, where the Latino community stands to benefit significantly, and which, like naturalization, right, becoming a U.S. citizen, requires outreach and efforts to get folks in a position to apply, is DACA, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. What has been the story on DACA? What more needs to be done 2 years after this historic program was announced? I know that there still is a number of young people who have not registered.
So one of the things I want to first say is that DACA was really a game changer. And it was really a win that the community brought forth. And I think we have to say thank you to all of you, because you really were able to pressure the administration to say this is the right thing to do, and politically and for policy's sake, we're going to do this. Also, I want to recognize that then the Director of Homeland Security, and now Deputy Secretary Mayorkas, who was able to really implement this program in a way that was effective. And for the community, also, who we started working really hard to put together these clinics to help dreamers. One of the things that just recently, last week on Saturday, I went and flew down to Miami to help out in one of these clinics being done by FL Dream, one of the organizations there. And you would be surprised at the number of people that still don't know about these clinics. And we had a group of moms canvass and go out to the community, give out flyers, talk to the people in the restaurants and the hair salons. And people were like, oh, we never knew about this. Because unfortunately, some people don't have time to watch TV and watch the news to see what's happening. Some people don't have access to the internet. And so we really have to continue to go out to the community, reach out to the people, and not just think of the usual ways that we talk to the folks, but really go door knocking.
I was going to ask you, just as a follow-up, don't you think that because Latinos here, we're a large group, as you know, but we're a little bit fragmented in that there's Latinos that were born here, Latinos who's like first generation, right? Like myself, my parents were born there. And then there are the Latinos que no hablan bien inglés. I mean, we're just really complicated.
That's right. And one of the things that I think it's really important to note is that within the DACA process, 20% more or less of the people that were coming through had other forms of relief, could become residents, had abilities to get visas. And so that was one of the great things that also DACA was able to uncover, the fact that there's a lot of people out there that don't have the information to actually get papers. And that goes hand in hand with also people that don't know, for instance, that are residents, that they could become citizens. So we really have to do a better job in informing our community and going out there and door knocking and really, trying to get the information popularized in a way that we're reaching the schools, we're reaching the parents, and the community as a whole.
So you're really talking about a grassroots effort as well. Thank you. Jose, if or better stated when we get a broader legalization program, there will be a tremendous need to help eligible, we were just talking about DACA, the problems we face there, eligible immigrants to face the application process, right, to complete that. Deputy Secretary Mallorca's talked about the mixed story with respect to the philanthropic support of DACA. We're ready in the Latino community to mount an effort to serve that population that may be legalized. I mean, are we, and what are the challenges in the nonprofit sector?
I mean, well, it's a great question, and we have huge challenges. And just to follow up on what Gabby said, here in New York, we had 30,000, a little bit over 30,000 applicants for DACA, and we were overwhelmed in the nonprofit sector. Our immigrant service providers really struggled meeting sort of the demands from the community, and which happened obviously almost overnight, right? And it took time, and obviously the outreach that happened, there are huge capacity issues in our sector, and it's a great question overall because we think that the most important institutions we have in our community are our CBOs, are our community-based organizations that are the frontline service providers, are the social glue economic engines, leadership incubators of our community, and really are the champions for the families and the children of our community. And what's happened over the past decade, especially over the past 5 years, you've seen these huge cuts on the part of government that have decimated the sector. And you couple that with the fact that the foundation world, the philanthropy, is still giving less than 2% of its money to the Latino community, or to Latino institutions that serve that community. You couple that, and you have increasing demands on one side and lack of capacity on the other side. And so that needs to fundamentally change. I mean, the fair share equity, which we're constantly fighting, and I know we have a lot of our executive directors here, and so I'm sure they're happy to hear this. We need more resources in order to effectively do this work. Part of the reason that you don't have more kids, right, that have applied through DACA is because you have the lack of assistance, right, in our community. They're used to turning to our CBOs to be able to get help. In our CBOs, you have huge waiting lines at this point. You have huge waiting lines around ESL classes, around citizenship assistance, and on and on and on. We need to fundamentally change that, and so clearly we need to demand from the philanthropy sector and from government to better support our institutions. But likewise, this is a challenge for all of us. We also need to support our institutions. Every single person in here and everyone that's listening needs to support a MALDEF, needs to support an ALEO, Hispanic Federation, some of the organizations that are in this room, because imagine where we would be if we didn't have these institutions. Every single one of these issues, education, immigration, health, etc. The only way we tackle them is really through these community-based organizations. So fundamentally, we need to address that challenge, and we need to address it internally as a community, but obviously broadly in terms of philanthropy.
Stronger support. Okay. Tanya, it sometimes seems as though appropriate immigration relief, and indeed any talk of immigration reform triggers a very negative and even violent reaction, right? By some fringe elements in the nation. I could tell you that for a fact because I do radio and I do television. You know what I'm saying? So, what is the situation for the Latino community in this regard, and what should be done to address hate crime?
It's a significant problem. In fact, it's an alarming statistic that when the Department of Justice looked at the increasing numbers of hate crimes and violence, they discovered that 66% of hate crimes are targeted against Latinos.
Wow, that's a large number.
And that number is actually quite a depressed estimation. Mm-hmm. Why? Because the Department of Justice also noted that the vast majority of people who experience hate crime do not report it. In fact, they estimate that only 1 out of every 3 instances of hate crime are reported. And Latinos who are undocumented are particularly vulnerable and reticent about going to the police and reporting the assaults that they experience. And some would say, well, maybe they're not really hate crimes. Well, 99% of these assaults are accompanied by virulent hate speech, targeting and demeaning their ethnic background, their national origin. And fascinating studies are being done that tie together, very interestingly, the espousing of hate speech with actual hate crime. And so we see a very vicious circle where talk radio in particular links up illegal, Latino, and
I know who you're talking
undesirable.
About.
There are many of these people. There are many of them, unfortunately. Then with the talk radio, it then gets rebroadcast through social media, And then social media then goes to be broadcast by talk radio. So you've got a real high distribution, right, of these very negative stereotypes about Latinos and equating them as being undocumented in all the most negative senses of the word. And so what we're seeing is a portrayal of Latinos in the public rhetoric that is harmful to all Latinos, right? Because when we're walking around, we don't have a sign on our foreheads that says, "Not me, I'm documented."
Right. And how can you tell? I mean, I think that's a $1 million question. I did ask Governor Brewer at one point. I said, so how do you know if someone's documented or not? I'm still waiting for my answer, just saying. But I mean, do we know?
Yeah, exactly. And so, it's just based on our phenotype that there is this presumption, right, and hatred towards us. And so what we're seeing is a greater attention to looking at regulating hate speech. Right? Now, this is very forbidden in the United States, where we sort of wave the First Amendment as being the end-all and be-all. I got to be careful because there's so many journalists in the room. But at the same time, where you've got an expression of speech that has no public value, its only purpose is to demean people and to dehumanize them, then this is something that we need to revisit. And so, I mean, that's one small way we can start to address how the linking up of Latinos with undocumented status in the most negative fashion is harmful to us from our own physical safety.
And media does play a very important role. I always say there's power in words, so we have to be very careful. And our boss at CNN Español, Cynthia Hudson, is very good about it's documented and undocumented as opposed to anything else. Arturo, one obvious outcome of citizenship for Latino immigrants is the right to vote, right? And I know I voted, so you can't be mad at me. There. Despite our successes, over 11 million eligible Latinos did not vote in November of 2012. ¿Qué pasa? ¿Qué pasa? ¿Por qué no salieron a votar? What should we do to address the unengaged in our community? I mean, there's always the excuse of, well, the kids and, got to run to work. Not good enough.
Well, several things about what we at NLL call the great unengaged. 11 million Latino citizen adults who are largely unregistered to vote and who don't vote. And what we want to do at NLL is we want to go after that segment of our potential electorate because nobody is talking to them. Because if you are a likely voter, candidates will knock on your door, call you, send you mail, because they know if you're a likely voter, you're going to vote. If you're not a likely voter, you get ignored. And so these people are being ignored by our political system. We had a poll to ask them what they thought. We did focus groups. And one of the things we learned is that it's not that they're apathetic. They care very much about the future of their country, the future of their families. They care about the wars in the Middle East. They care about the economy. They have an opinion about Obamacare, about education. They care about everything. They just don't think voting will affect their daily lives. And when you think about it, when we talked about the presidential election, how many times did Mitt Romney and Barack Obama campaign in California? Not fundraise, campaign. How many times did they campaign, not fundraise, in Texas? They didn't. They spent all their time in New Mexico and Ohio and these swing states. The problem is that half of our potential vote is in California and Texas. And so we have to go out and tell Latinos in California and Texas, you know what? Even though the president and Governor Romney are not coming here to ask for your vote matters anyway. It's our perverse election system that actually discourages people from voting. So we have to not just convince people the importance of their vote, but we have to actually deal with the structural things in our political system that actually discourage people from voting and actually convince people that voting doesn't make a difference for them. That's the political system we truly have in this country, and we need to change it.
Tom, you talked about the Voting Rights Act and the threats to it in your speech. What can we do to ensure that Latinos who do want to vote can do so without any significant barriers?
Well, I think it is about some of the barriers that Arturo and Jose have mentioned. It's about the things that hit the headlines, including the voter ID provisions that are supposedly generated by a concern about voter fraud, when we know that instances of documented voter fraud are not only few and far between, they are minuscule. So these measures are really about trying to deter folks from voting, making it more difficult. You know, last month, January 23rd, was the 50th anniversary of the 24th Amendment. And most people don't remember what the 24th Amendment is, because it's not one that gets a lot of press. But it's
Tanya remembers.
She's a law professor. She's a law professor. 24th Amendment banned poll taxes. But effectively what we have today are poll taxes in a different form. When you're required to go and obtain some form of identification that you have to either pay out of pocket to obtain, or you have to travel long distances to go to an office that will issue you the ID that you need, or you have to engage in a hard target search for a lost birth certificate, and you may never find that birth certificate because, in fact, you may have been born at a time that records weren't digitized, and there may have been a fire or a flood or something else at the registrar's office where you happen to have been born, and that certificate doesn't exist. So the effort and money that goes into obtaining what you need to then be able to vote is really the modern equivalent of a poll tax. And we have this not just when it comes to voting, but increasingly when it comes to registered to vote. We have states, Arizona and Kansas, for example, that are still attempting to require that you present one of a very small number of identification documents before you can register to vote. So there's those headline-reaching efforts on voter ID and voter registration restrictions that we have to ensure go away. But we've also got to address the ones that don't necessarily make the headlines. The redistricting problems, the problems when we have jurisdictions that switch from being districted to at-large. City of Pasadena, Texas, that MALDEF is in the process of suing right now, decided recently to switch from having 8 single-member districts on its city council to have 6 single-member districts and 2 at-large. The reason that they decided to do that is the Latino community in Pasadena, Texas is on the cusp of being the majority. So they want to ensure that they won't control the majority of the city council, so they recreate 2 at-large districts knowing and believing that the non-Latino community, the white community, will control the outcome with respect to at least those 2 seats as well as some number of those districts. These are the kinds of steps that used to be blocked by the Voting Rights Act until the Supreme Court majority decided Shelby County versus Holder and took one of the most powerful civil rights tools of our entire history away from us by concluding that the coverage formula that required certain jurisdictions with demonstrated histories of voter suppression to get all of their voter changes, like going to at-large elections, pre-cleared or approved by the Department of Justice, that went away. We now have, fortunately, a bipartisan bill introduced in Congress, both the Senate and the House, to address that decision and put in place a new coverage formula. It's an important start that we have to support. But in the Latino community, we have to demand more. The right to vote is too significant, is too important. For our community and for the nation, we have to demand more than what's in the currently introduced bill. In particular, NALEO and MALDEF have been a part of a small group of organizations that have put forward something that's become called known practices coverage, that would say wherever you are in the country, if you want to engage in certain practices that we know historically have resulted in suppressing the vote, like converting from single-member districts to at-large, like moving precincts, consolidating precincts in certain neighborhoods but not in others, like deciding that you're going to change how you distribute, what you distribute in languages other than English to those recently naturalized citizens who need those bilingual materials. Those kinds of known practices would have to be pre-approved under known practices coverage, no matter where in the country you are. Now that's important because we have voter suppression efforts going on in communities where there hasn't been a history of a large enough minority community for there to have been a decades-long record of having violated voting rights. If the community was almost all white, you wouldn't have a decades-long record of having engaged in voter discrimination. But when a community like the Latino community, new and emerging, begins to achieve political power, perhaps even majority political power, what would you expect those in charge to begin to do? They start to put in place practices to suppress the vote of that community. So we need a formula that addresses those new and emerging communities, whether they're Latino or Asian American or Native American or African American, all across the country. And I believe the Latino community is in a position to ensure that the voting rights amendments that are ultimately adopted, because they will be adopted, that the voting rights amendments that are put in place in response to Shelby County are an adequate civil rights law for the next 50 years.
Great information. Thank you, Tom. I just want to remind you, we are live on the web, so tweet us, the hashtag being Latino State of the Union 2014, and also E_Espinosa is my tweet, so I can follow you here. Jose,
Yes.
the world of the web now, right? We have to tweet to Instagram.
Tweet away.
That's right. But this is good because this is a way of reaching the masses, and we need our young
Sure.
people. So as we understandably focus on immigration and voting as burning issues before Congress, we all know that education, as Tom discussed in his remarks, is critical to long-term Latino community success. So what can we do about the persisting gap, Latino educational gap?
That's another depressing state of affairs. It pains
Don't
me-
be depressing. You're not allowed
yes,
anymore.
ma'am. It pains me to say, it does pain me to say that we remain the least well-educated segment of the American population. The reality is that our kids are not being served well by our public schools. Our kids are attending segregated, overcrowded, and underfunded public schools. Also look at the fact that Latinos are not participating in pre-K programs. They're less likely to do well, right, around reading and math and read at grade proficiency levels. They're less likely to attend rigorous academic courses and less likely to graduate from high school. And so the dynamic that is created is this domino effect that when they get to college, they're not prepared academically to do well in college. And it's almost a recipe for disaster. And when we look at the Latino college graduation rate in this country, you alluded to this before, when you look at Latinos over the age of 25, only 19% have a college degree. When you compare that to whites, it's less than half. Whites stand at 43%. So that gap, right, that Latino college dropout rate, it's startling.
Yeah.
As devastating as the high school dropout rate is, it is startling. And so Tom said something last year, which was really important as I was kind of reviewing some of the things that were said last year. There's a structural inequity in our system that has this dynamic that really feeds the Latino education gap, where you have the wealthier schools getting the vast majority of money, when you get the wealthier schools getting the best teachers, when you have the poorer communities getting less funding and getting the less qualified teachers. We fundamentally need to change that, and there's a legal aspect to that needs to happen, but also in terms of what we're doing right in our communities, we need to make sure that our parents are engaged, that schools are welcoming to those parents. We need to make sure that we know what works, right? We know that, again, if you have strong teachers, you have parents that are engaged, you have a sort of a welcoming environment that allows community to come in, and it takes a village, right, sort of that saying, we know that our kids are going to succeed. So we know what works, but structurally, there is this fundamental problem that continues to feed this education gap, and until we address that, we're constantly swimming upstream. And so I think we should start there. It's a complex issue, but that would be a great place to start to really make a significant difference over the coming years.
That's fair. Tanya, what have the courts been doing lately around Latino access to and success in higher education?
Well, I mean, just last year we had the Fisher decision that came out. This is regarding the use of race as one factor in the admissions to the public university, the University of Texas at Austin. And while the court reaffirmed the ability to look at race as one factor in the admissions process, it narrowed the ability to actually use race-conscious policies to effectuate integration and to create more access for Latinos and other people of color. It did this by saying that just like the use of race had to be subject to judicial very high scrutiny, the implementation of that policy also had to be put under judicial scrutiny. And there's no deference to the university's own expression of wanting to be able to use the affirmative action policy to increase diversity. And indeed, there's no belief in good faith on the part of the university. Right? So in Fisher, their policy got sent back to the district courts for reexamination. Right? So that's still in the pipeline for examination. More troubling, though, is a new case that the Supreme Court is considering in its term this year. Our argument was held just in October. A case called Schuett, I think I'm pronouncing that properly, versus the Coalition to Defend Affirmative Action. This is looking at a state ban on affirmative action that the Michigan state government instituted. And there's a challenge now to that ban, and so the court is looking at whether or not the state ban on all uses of affirmative action in public university itself violates the United States Supreme Court equality amendments. And so the reason why I say this decision is more troubling is because it has the potential to extend more into the public sphere than even the Fisher case, where Fisher's just looking at public universities and just their own specific policy. When looking at the ability of a state to ban affirmative action in its totality, this is a far-reaching decision. And so I'm a bit nervous about what the Supreme Court is up to and whether or not Justice Stevens can be convinced to decide in the most affirming ways. We'll see.
Absolutely. Gabby, so much of the success of the Dreamers has been tied to their educational achievements, right? But they face substantial obstacles to completing higher education. So what are those obstacles? If you can tell us a bit about that and what's being done about it.
Sure. Well, one of the things that has been great about MALDEF is the Plyler versus Stowe, right? And the fact that they were able to fight for us 50 years ago for us to be able to go from kindergarten to 12th grade. But college has not been accessible. And for the last 15 years, yes, we've had 19 states that have what they call in-state tuition. So students are able to go to the colleges and pay what is the in-state tuition rate. There's also states, 4 of them, that have banned Dreamers from being able to even go to college. And so there's a lot of disparity in the access to higher education for Dreamers. They don't have access to financial aid, grants, many of the times loans. And even though the DACA program really was able to open the doors for Dreamers to not have the fear of deportation and be able to get a work permit, in many states like in Florida, Dreamers are not able to go to college and pay the in-state tuition rate. So they have to pay 4 times as much as their students without any access to financial aid.
Wow.
However, there's good news. There's been a lot of people in the private sector that have started to come together to say enough. We're not going to wait for Congress to do something to take action. We're going to take matters into our own hands. And just recently on February 4th, there was a scholarship called the Dream.us that was launched with $25 million. And we know that $25 million is going to probably help maybe 1,000 students from the thousands and hundreds of thousands of students that don't have access to higher education, but it's the beginning. And I think that one of the things that we're seeing is more and more students are able to graduate from college. It's estimated that there's about 80,000 Dreamers that are in school and have been able to attain a bachelor's degree. And from those 80,000, there's 8,000 of them who are in graduate programs. So 2 of them who are actually in California, who are going into medical school. Many Dreamers have graduated from law schools and have been able to attain law degrees. And so there's a lot of hope. And I think one of the biggest obstacles that we do see is that, one, teachers, because of the immigration issue, think that maybe their students are not going to be able to go to school. So counselors sometimes misguide the students and say, maybe you're not going to be able to go to college. But the other factor that has been an obstacle for a lot of Dreamers is our own family. And it's the fear that our parents have that if we try to go to college and submit those applications, that we're going to be heartbroken. And so many of the times our parents don't really push us to be able to do that because of their own fears of what's going to happen to their children. So I think that for us, for the community, one, we have to continue to support efforts like these scholarship programs that are starting to come out throughout the whole nation. And MALDEF actually has been one of the leading organizations opening doors for our Dreamers through scholarship programs, but also, making sure that our parents know that where there's a will, there's a way. And that saying, right, si se puede, is so important because it has taken our community for now decades, right, to know that when we set ourselves to do something like Dreamers have, we've been unstoppable and we've been able to accomplish those degrees.
Impressive, impressive. Fear is paralyzing, there's no question about it. Arturo, beyond our successful college students, the entire Latino community, right, we're here as well in the Time Warner Center, does not always get the information, education they need to ensure so that they can, contribute to our Latino advancement. It seems, I know, a little bit odd to talk about the census in mid-decade. It's a little early. But we need to get a start, right, on making 2020 a success. What should each and every one of us watching right now, listening here in the room, do about the 2020 census?
Well, the 2020 census is right around the corner. I mean, it's 2014 already.
Don't
But
scare
one of
me,
the things
don't
that the
scare me.
Census Bureau is doing right now that we need to engage with is that the Bureau is trying to redesign the way it asks everybody, what is your race and are you Hispanic or not? And this is one of the most fundamental purposes of the census, is collecting race and Hispanic origin data, because that's the only way that we can enforce the civil rights laws, if we have accurate data. And we know there has been a consistent undercount of Latinos in every single census. And then sometimes we don't get it quite right in being able to give everybody in this country the opportunity to self-identify who and what they are and how they identify racially and ethnically. So at NALEO, we're working very closely with the Census Bureau as it conducts research to try to determine how best to ask the question. 2020 may be 6 years away, but the decisions about what will be asked in 2020 will have to be done within the next 2 years. Because then the Census Bureau has to report to Congress what's going to be on the census form, and then they have to print, 150 million forms, and that takes time. So all this needs to be done by 2017. So we need to engage with the Census Bureau. We need to make sure that every single person gets counted in every single census. And it's the only thing this government does that touches everybody equally. Because no matter if you're a man or a woman, a child or an adult, Black, Latino, Asian or Native American, gay or straight, everybody counts equally in the census. It's the one thing the government does in which all of us are truly equal.
Thank you. Tom, besides the census, what should we be looking to address in future years as we look ahead?
Well, I think we do have to look ahead. And I think we have to look ahead at what are the secondary and tertiary impacts of some of the things that we're working on today. If we do, or when we do, achieve a legalization program, we will be adding to the workforce across this country. And I think we need to be prepared for seeing widespread discrimination in employment. Unfortunately, the Latino community's experience historically and continuing in the workforce is that we are often the first targets of discrimination. And that's not always discrimination solely on the basis of ethnicity or race. It can be on the basis of other things as well. MALDEF has recently undertaken a number of cases where we're representing Latino and Latina workers who were discriminated against not only because they are Latino, but also because of their LGBT identity, or because of their health status, or because of their gender. And this phenomenon of multiple discrimination, multiple bases for discriminating, seems to target and land on our community first. Recently, MALDEF testified before the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in hopes that the EEOC, and I think they will, would update their guidance about national origin discrimination. And one way that we believe they need to update their guidance is around this specific issue. Too often when an employer decides, oh, I guess I can't discriminate on the basis of race or ethnicity, but maybe I can discriminate on this other basis, they tend to target still the most vulnerable workers, and that includes the Latino and Latino workforce. So this phenomenon of multiple basis discrimination is going to hit us even more than it's already hitting us as we expand the Latino workforce through a legalization program. And I think, like the census, it's one of the things that we need to get out in front of and be ahead of and make our views known to the EEOC and to Congress about guarding against this kind of discrimination.
Tanya, well, Tom just mentioned employment discrimination, right? So what are the barriers the Latino community faces, in your mind, in protecting employment rights in the courts?
Well, unfortunately, we have a Supreme Court that has been interpreting the employment discrimination laws in very narrow ways. Right? So just this last term, in a case called Vance versus Ball State University, the Supreme Court said, well, if you want to file a sexual harassment claim and you want to seek compensation against the employer for tolerating the sexual harassment in the workplace, you have to show that it was a supervisor, in the narrower sense of the word, who harassed you. Meaning, If it was someone who could not determine whether you are hired or fired or promoted, they didn't have that official label of supervisor, then their harassment doesn't matter as far as employer liability. If the person who's been harassing you, though, is someone who could make your life a living hell at the workplace by doing what? Changing your shifts, by deciding what kind of assignments you get, that doesn't count. For the Supreme Court, that's not enough of a supervisor because that person doesn't affect a tangible workplace policy for you. Now, mind you, that's a very classist perspective about a supervisor in the workplace, right? Because in the low-wage worker sector, the people who determine your shift, right, when you worked, who you work with, they fundamentally influence your life as a worker. That's not very material to people who work in the white-collar sector. We go in when we, we have a doctor's appointment, we go to a doctor, right? This is not the case for low-wage workers. Right? So this is not a Supreme Court that is hospitable to worker claims. In fact, in a related case this past term called University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center versus Nassar, the Supreme Court again looked at the issue of retaliation. Right? And retaliation is a significant part of employment discrimination law because more often than not, the way we get the employer is not through the actual claim of discrimination. That's so hard to prove, the intent to discriminate, that often the way in which the few people who file discrimination claims are made whole is when the employer then retaliates against you because you raised the issue of discrimination. Right? They act the fool in the workplace. So the Supreme Court has now narrowed that field. In this decision, they said that in order for you to bring your retaliation claim, you have this higher standard of proof. You must show that it was a but-for cause when you raise the discrimination issue, that for that reason alone, the employer retaliated against you. This is in contrast to a more lenient standard called a mixed motive standard. Not to get too technical on you, but what that essentially meant was that if it was one reason amongst many, if it was a motivating factor amongst other factors for retaliating against you, you could still satisfy and bring a retaliation claim, no more. So you see a Supreme Court that's narrowing the ability to use the law to bring employment discrimination. So, if the follow-up question I would imagine, well, what do we do about this? We need to lobby our legislators, right, to undo the harm that the Supreme Court does when it narrowly interprets law.
But I think it's about getting that out there. But how do
people?
people know about that, right? Like your everyday citizen. I mean, there's that challenge as well.
This is true.
So, but it's a valid, very strong point. Jose, what about health issues, which Tom also mentioned about the implementation of Obamacare, the impact on our community, Latinos?
So it's a great question. I see people tweeting, so that's a good thing. You should be happy about that.
I am.
Yeah,
Thank
so we're
you.
covering all the bases here. Right? We got health, we got immigration, voting rights, education. Health is obviously critical, obviously, to the well-being of our community. And no community stands to benefit more than Obamacare. And we've appropriated that term in a positive way. And I think that, we have had, and we have huge issues with getting Latinos enrolled, right, in the Affordable Care Act. Part of it has been obviously some of the, well-discussed issues around the website, but also really just getting basic information out to our community. So Hispanic Federation is working in Houston, is working in Pennsylvania, is working in Florida to really get the word out to Latinos and why this is important. No community, again, stands to benefit more from the passage of Obamacare because we happen to be the community that's most uninsured, right, in the nation, right? So more than 35% of Latinos don't have health insurance across the nation. We fundamentally need to change that. And so one of the reasons that we were so excited about the passage of the Affordable Care Act was because it was going to give us this vehicle to really insure many more Latinos. We're not there. We're far from there. But again, you're starting to see movement in the right direction. And ultimately, I believe that not only Latinos, but Americans of all stripes will come to embrace this law and will come to see for what it is, right? It really is an opportunity, right? It seems common sense to me that, an opportunity to gain health access, right? To gain access to quality health care. Why is that a bad thing, right? But all these misperceptions that have been created on the media, we've had a really hard time combating that, and even within our own community that stands to benefit the most, but we're getting there. And I think we all need to continue to sort of, spread the gospel, if you will, around what this law really is and what it isn't, we have a huge deadline that's coming up, March 31st, right? In terms of the open enrollment, we need to drive Latinos to get enrolled, right? And so one of the great things that have happened here in New York State, but in other states as well, too, that you do have navigator systems that are set up, and you have community-based organizations that are there to help community. And so the website is also now, I think, fairly easy to navigate. So also, please encourage people to do so, because again, at the end of the day, what are we trying to do? We're trying to lower healthcare costs. We're trying to make sure that people are insured in the richest country in the world, right? I mean,
But what did you think it's also the trust? There's a trust issue here as well with the government in our community.
Well, I mean, I think part of it is, right, and you know, it's unfortunate, actually, it's tragic, the fact that we didn't allow undocumented to enroll in health insurance, and something that we fought, you know, very hard, and unfortunately, we had actually at that point passed it on the House side, and the Senate, you know, nixed it. And so it's tragic in that case that you have that dynamic, but the reality is that, you know, if you're here legally permanent resident, you can go and get health insurance for the very first time in many cases, right? We're insuring people that, you know, didn't in their wildest dreams think that they could get health insurance in this country or could afford it, right? I think that that's the big piece, the affordability piece, right? It's not just about having access, but now that you can actually afford it, we're getting some rates where people are paying $60 a month and having entire family coverage.
People
right?
with pre-existing conditions, which is like
And people with
the biggest,
pre-existing conditions.
exactly.
There's a lot of great benefits to this law. And when we think about the health disparities that impact our community, diabetes, we think about, you know, high rates of asthma, high rates of cardiovascular disease, all those things are connected back to the lack of health access that we have as a community.
Childhood obesity is one of them that affects our community greatly as well.
Yep.
Gabby, what about the dreamers who are young, therefore relatively healthy, right? But is health, you know, healthcare a concern?
It definitely is. And I think that's a big misconception, that because you're young, you're healthy and you don't need to see a doctor. And one of the things about preventive care is actually being able to know from a young age how your health is. Some of these things are part of our genes, right? It's not something that when you turn 50, they wake up in you, right? So one of the things that was really just disconcerting to the community is how the Obama administration blindsided us, and just from one day to another, said people who have DACA will not be able to get will not be able to participate in the Affordable Care Act. And I remember that day where we just started calling each other and said, "What happened? Did Republicans start talking about this? Was this something that was creating a chaos in the administration?" And it really was with no need that the administration did this. And it was really one of the things that really disappointed the undocumented community, and more than anything, Latinos, because as we know, undocumenteds don't live in a silo. We don't live in bubbles. I have a sister who's about to become a U.S. citizen. My husband is a legal permanent resident. So, you know, our community as a whole, we're interconnected, and these things affect us, all of us. So not being able to have access to healthcare was something that I think was a big mistake by the administration. It's something that we're going to have to continue to fight for. And as young people, those that have access to be able to get healthcare should be enrolling, because it's something really important for our community, for the youth, and also for the future of the Latinos in this country.
Tom.
I just wanted to add how irrational it is to have excluded Dreamers from the Affordable Care Act, because we are all hearing now more and more how important it is to get young people enrolled, because we recognize it is true, they do need access to health, particularly preventative care, but the young do use less expensive care than older folks. So we need to balance out the pool by having more young people enrolled in the programs under the ACA. So it's not really rational, even from the perspective of what Obamacare attempts to achieve, to have excluded this category, DACA recipients, who are entirely within that younger cohort that we need.
Absolutely.
Let me just add real quickly, the whole system is predicated, right? The success of the system is predicated on getting young, healthy people into the system. So it shows you the rationality when we start talking about the issue of immigration. The fact that we didn't allow undocumented to participate in the Affordable Care Act is just completely irrational. There's people that were going to pay out of their own pockets, as opposed to going to an emergency room, right, and then having taxpayers pay for it. I mean, the irrationality goes beyond anything that you can make any sense of, right?
Well, they're a big part of the economy when you think about, you know, the undocumented, a huge part of our economy. Well, in closing, let's look forward to a quarter century in the future. So here's my question. What do each of you see for the Latino community? How do we facilitate getting there, which is, of course, the hardest part, right, in the most productive way? So let's start with Arturo.
Wow.
It's not a hard question or anything.
No pressure at the
No pressure.
No pressure. If you look at where we were 25 years ago, look at all that's happened. Within the next 25 years, I think we will have a Latino or Latina president. I think we will have...
Yes, I like this. I like this. And by the way, it's a minute each. Sorry, I'm the time
All right,
checker.
I'll leave it at that.
I like it. Muy bien, me parece muy bien. Tanya.
I think that the way forward is going to be uniting as a community, right? Across our different ethnic origins, across our different skin color and
Yes.
races, and our sexual orientation, that we can't allow those divisions to keep us from coming together in ways that are useful for all of us. And also that would also be the cleavage between documented and undocumented, right? That what happens to one part of our community really affects all of us. And so we need to think in those unified ways.
What is your Latino heritage? Is that asked?
Oh, puertorriqueña y cubana.
Aha.
even.
You can get along. I love it. I'm Mexican Salvadoran, and supposedly there's a rivalry, and I'm like, it's okay. I love myself. I hate myself. Okay. It works somehow. Gabi.
Well, I think that one of the things that I see as a Latina, as a woman, as a person who is fighting for my rights and the rights of my family and my parents, is that sometimes we have to call other people to leadership. And we have to ensure that there is space for young people to be in the room. So I want to say thank you for inviting me to participate in this. And I think it's really important that young people see themselves in the room, in the discussion, and that we are preparing ourselves, because as it is, we are going to be a majority in this country, and our future is our children. And so we need to have role models so that they could look up to, and so that they could say, you know, I'm going to be the next Latina president of the United States, or I'm going to run for office, or I'm going to get a PhD.
I love it. Thank you. Jose.
Education, education, education. That really is the way forward for our community. And really, you know, I'm a big believer in self-determination. And so I think that, you know, we need to educate our community. We need to make sure that our kids are prepared to succeed in college, because everything will flow from there. And I would say, you know, I mentioned about community-based organizations, and I want to repeat that, because when we think about self-determination, that's how we're going to ensure, you know, that we're going to have a strong community, when we invest in ourselves. So the last message that I want to leave with you is get connected to institutions, get connected to our nonprofits, invest and support in them, because that's going to grow community power. That truly is how we empower our community. And so again, self-determination starts with our nonprofits, and it starts with education as well too.
And of course, Tom Science, MALDEF President and General Counsel.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And you've been a wonderful moderator. We
Thank you.
nothing but love you. We don't have that.
Muchas gracias. I'll send the check later. Thank you.
I think the key to the next 25 years for the Latino community is engagement. Engagement in everything, not just in voting that we've spent a great deal of today talking about, but also engagement in education, engagement in media, both traditional and online media, engagement in every aspect of society, and ensuring that there are opportunities for engagement by our family members, no matter their age, by our community members, no matter their status, by everyone throughout the nation. We need to seek greater engagement.
Thank you very much, all of you. What an amazing panel discussion. Thank you so much. Brilliant. You know, it is clear from our discussion today that while we have made tremendous progress, you know, we still must remain very vigilant in our pursuit of real change for Latinos. And as a special needs advocate, I just got to throw that in there as well, because documented or undocumented, they need a voice as well. And for the entire nation, it is our hope that, you know, this forum has provided some of the critical tools that we all need to leave this forum, seize upon the areas of consensus, and help one another. I think that's very important. I heard that quite a bit here today. Help one another, regardless if you're from this part, West Coast, East Coast, you know, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Mexican, Salvadoran, Guatemalan. Help one another in the service of our collective goal to improve life for Latinos in the United States of America. And it has truly been my pleasure, my honor, serving as your moderator today. So thank you so much. Si se puede, y también don't forget to vote. Elizabeth Espinosa, signing off. Thank you so much. Thank you.